Hi, I'm Rebecca Morrison. The morning my mother stood in our family's marble foyer and declared, "We're cutting you off from everything," was the same morning Klaus Brenner from Credit Suisse called to discuss my offshore portfolio worth $8.7 million. They said I was ungrateful, said I was a disappointment, said I had wasted every opportunity they'd given me. That declaration echoed through the halls of our Millbrook estate like a death sentence, but what they didn't know was that their judgment was about to become irrelevant in ways they never could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You see, what happened next didn't just flip the script on my family's power games. It exposed 3 generations of lies, manipulation, and a financial empire built on assumptions that crumbled the moment Klaus asked me about assets I never knew I had. The look on my brother Tyler's face when he realized he wasn't the golden child he thought he was. That was just the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape everything we thought we knew about success, family, and who really held the cards in the Morrison dynasty. The grandfather clock in the Morrison family foyer had been chiming 7:30 every morning for as long as I could remember, its deep bronze notes rolling through the colonial mansion like a daily reminder of tradition and order. This particular Tuesday morning in October, the sound felt more like a funeral bell. I sat at the breakfast table in the sunroom, watching condensation slide down the tall windows that overlooked our manicured gardens, now brittle and brown with the season's first frost. The silence at breakfast had become a ritual of its own over the past few months. My mother Linda moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had never had to wonder where her next meal would come from, preparing Tyler's preferred steel-cut oats and fresh berries, while my father Frank buried himself behind the Wall Street Journal. The newspaper crinkled with each page turn, a sound that had once meant comfort and stability but now felt like the rustle of judgment being passed. I nursed my coffee black and bitter because we'd run out of cream and nobody had thought to ask if I needed anything from the grocery store. It was a small thing, but small things had been adding up lately. My freelance graphic design work had been steady enough to cover my basic expenses, but living back home at 28 after my apartment lease fell through had become a source of increasing tension. Every morning felt like walking on ice that grew thinner with each step. Tyler's chair scraped against the hardwood as he checked his phone, scrolling through what I assumed were emails from Morrison Import-Export, the family business that had been his birthright since the day he was born. He wore success like a well-tailored suit, comfortable and unquestioned. His wedding photos with Jessica still dominated the mantelpiece, their perfect smiles frozen in time from 3 years ago when everything in the Morrison family had felt solid and predictable. The first crack in that facade came when my mother finally spoke, her voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded earthquakes. "Rebecca, your father and I have been discussing your situation." She didn't look up from arranging Tyler's breakfast on fine china that had been in our family for 4 generations. "We think it's time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet without our support." I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care, watching the dark liquid slosh against the white porcelain. "I've been contributing to household expenses," I said quietly. "I pay for my own food, my own gas, my phone bill. I'm not asking for handouts." Frank folded his newspaper with surgical precision, the creases sharp enough to cut skin. "You're nearly 30 years old, Rebecca. When I was your age, I already had the business expansion into European markets well underway. You're living like a college student with no direction and no prospects." The words hit like carefully aimed arrows, each one finding its mark in insecurities I'd been carrying for years. Tyler finally looked up from his phone, his expression a mixture of pity and superiority that I'd grown to recognize as his default setting when it came to family discussions about my future. "Mom and Dad aren't trying to be harsh," he said, his voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who'd never had to question his place in the world, "but you've been drifting for months now. Maybe some tough love is what you need to find your motivation." Linda nodded as if Tyler had just delivered profound wisdom instead of a patronizing lecture. We've decided that by the end of this week, you'll need to find your own accommodation. We'll give you until Sunday to make arrangements. The sunroom suddenly felt airless despite its high ceilings and generous windows. You're kicking me out, I said, the words coming out flatter than I intended. We're encouraging independence. Frank corrected, his tone suggesting the conversation was already over in his mind. Your trust fund from your grandmother's estate has been adequate for your needs, but it's clearly not motivating you toward meaningful achievement. Something cold settled in my chest. What trust fund? Tyler's eyebrows raised slightly, the one Grandma Helen set up for all of us. Don't tell me you've forgotten about that. I stared at him, genuinely confused. I've never received anything from a trust fund. I've been living on freelance income and the small savings I had from working retail during college. The silence that followed was different from the morning's usual quiet. This was the kind of silence that preceded revelations, the kind that made everyone suddenly interested in avoiding eye contact. Linda's hands stilled on the coffee pot. Frank's newspaper remained folded but forgotten in his lap. Tyler looked between our parents with an expression that suggested he'd just realized he'd said something he shouldn't have. Perhaps we should discuss this later, Linda said finally, her voice tight with something that might have been panic. But later never came, because 20 minutes after that conversation, I found myself standing in the foyer with 2 suitcases that Linda had retrieved from the storage room, their wheels squeaking against the marble floor like a protest against the entire situation. We're not doing this to punish you, Frank said, though his inability to meet my eyes suggested otherwise. Sometimes people need to face real consequences to discover their potential. Tyler stood at the base of the mahogany staircase, his arms crossed over his chest like a bouncer at an exclusive club. You'll thank us for this someday, he said, when you're finally living up to your capabilities instead of coasting on family goodwill. The cruelty of it was breathtaking in its casual efficiency. No dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, just the methodical dismantling of my place in the family structure, with all the emotional resonance of a business transaction. They'd made their decision with the same dispassionate calculation that had built the Morrison fortune over 3 generations. Linda pressed an envelope into my hand as I reached for the door handle. There's $500 in there, she said, to help with your transition. I looked down at the envelope. Cream-colored and expensive, the kind of stationery that proclaimed good breeding and careful attention to appearances. $500 to close the book on 28 years of being their daughter. The mathematics of it was almost impressive in its inadequacy. I don't want your money, I said, trying to hand it back. Take it, Frank insisted. We're not heartless, Rebecca. We want you to succeed. I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket, not because I wanted their charity, but because I needed time to process what had just happened. The morning had started with coffee and silence, and ended with exile, the transition so swift and clinical that I felt like I was watching it happen to someone else. The October air bit through my
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Jacket as I stood on the circular driveway, looking back at the house that had been home for most of my life. The Morrison mansion sat on 3 acres of perfectly maintained grounds, its colonial architecture and professional landscaping a testament to old money and older traditions. Now it looked like a fortress, beautiful and impenetrable, designed to keep people like me on the outside looking in. I wheeled my suitcases down the long driveway, past the hedge maze that Tyler and I had played in as children, past the tennis court where I'd learned to serve and volley under the patient instruction of a coach whose salary probably exceeded my annual income. Each step felt like walking away from not just a house, but from an identity I'd spent nearly 3 decades building. At the bottom of the driveway, I called an Uber to take me to the train station. The driver, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a slight accent, helped me load my suitcases into her trunk without asking questions about why I looked like I was fleeing something. Hartford, she asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. Yes, the train station, As we pulled away from Oak Ridge Drive, I watched the house disappear behind the curve of maple trees that had been planted when my great-grandfather first bought the property in 1960. I'd grown up hearing stories about those early days, about the immigrant determination that had built our family's success from nothing into something that commanded respect in Connecticut's business circles. What I hadn't heard, apparently, were stories about trust funds and inheritances that somehow never materialized in my bank account. The conversation at breakfast replayed in my mind like a recording I couldn't turn off. Tyler's casual mention of grandmother's estate, my parents' sudden discomfort when I'd expressed confusion, the way they'd rushed to end the discussion and move toward my eviction. The train to Hartford was nearly empty in mid-morning, filled mostly with a few business travelers and college students heading back to campus after a long weekend. I found a window seat and settled in for the 40-minute ride, watching Connecticut's suburban landscape roll past in a blur of strip malls and office parks. My phone buzzed as the train pulled out of the Millbrook station, a text from Tyler, "Hope you find what you're looking for. Maybe this will be the wake-up call you needed." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. What was there to say? That being abandoned by your family wasn't actually a motivational technique. That cutting someone off from everything they'd known wasn't the same as encouraging independence. Another buzz, this time from an unknown international number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was spam, but something about the timing made me curious. "Miss Morrison, this is Klaus Brenner from Credit Suisse Private Banking in Zurich. We need to discuss some important matters regarding your accounts. Could you please call me at your earliest convenience?" I read the message 3 times before it began to sink in. Credit Suisse, private banking, my accounts. The words didn't make sense in any configuration I could imagine. I'd never been to Switzerland. I'd never opened a private banking account anywhere, let alone in Zurich. The only bank account I had was a checking account at First National with a balance that rarely exceeded $1,000. But Klaus Brenner seemed to think otherwise. The train swayed gently as it picked up speed, carrying me away from the only life I'd ever known towards something that felt completely unknown. In my jacket pocket, the envelope from Linda crinkled when I shifted position, a reminder of how quickly family support could evaporate when it became inconvenient. I pulled out my phone and dialed the international number, my hands trembling slightly as I waited for the connection to go through. Klaus Brenner speaking. His voice was crisp and professional, with the slight accent of someone who spoke multiple languages fluently. Background noise suggested a busy office environment, the kind of place where serious money was managed by serious people. "This is Rebecca Morrison," I said. "You sent me a text about accounts, Miss Morrison." "Yes, thank you for calling so promptly. I hope you'll forgive the direct contact, but we've been trying to reach you through our usual channels without success. It appears there may have been some communication issues with your correspondence address." "I think there's been a mistake," I said. "I don't have any accounts with Credit Suisse." A pause, followed by the sound of papers rustling. "I'm looking at documentation that suggests otherwise. Could you please confirm your full legal name and date of birth for verification purposes?" I provided the information, feeling increasingly surreal about the entire conversation. Through the train window, suburban Hartford was giving way to the city's modest skyline, a collection of office buildings and insurance company headquarters that had never looked so welcoming. "Yes, that matches our records perfectly," Klaus said. "Miss Morrison, according to our files, you are the primary beneficiary of the Helen Morrison Trust, which was established in 1987 and has been managed by our private wealth division for the past 36 years. The train car suddenly felt like it was spinning. Helen Morrison was my grandmother. Indeed, the trust was structured to provide distributions beginning on your 28th birthday, which I believe was last month. We've been attempting to contact you regarding the initial disbursement of $800,000, with additional distributions scheduled quarterly thereafter. $800,000. The number bounced around my skull like a pinball, refusing to settle into anything resembling comprehension. "There must be some mistake," I repeated, though the words felt increasingly hollow. "Nobody ever told me about a trust fund." "I see." Klaus's tone shifted slightly, becoming more cautious. Miss Morrison, are you currently in a position to speak privately about sensitive financial matters? I looked around the train car. The nearest passenger was 3 rows away, absorbed in her laptop. Yes, I can talk. The Helen Morrison Trust currently holds assets valued at approximately $8.7 million, primarily invested in a diversified portfolio of international equities, government bonds, and alternative investments. Your grandmother's instructions were quite specific about when and how the distributions should begin. $8.7 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real, like reading about astronomical distances or geological timescales. It belonged to a different universe than the one where I'd just been kicked out of my childhood home with $500 in cash. Klaus, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. What address do you have on file for communications? 847 Oak Ridge Drive, Millbrook, Connecticut. All trust correspondence has been sent there for the past 15 years, initially addressed to your legal guardian, and then directly to you once you reached majority age. The address of the house I'd just been evicted from. The house where my parents had received every letter, every notification, every piece of documentation related to an $8.7 million trust fund that somehow never made it to my attention. I never received any of those letters, I said. Another pause, longer this time. When Klaus spoke again, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd seen enough family financial drama to recognize the signs. Miss Morrison, I think it would be beneficial for us to meet in person to discuss this situation. Are you available to travel to New York? We have a partner office in Manhattan that could facilitate a confidential consultation. When would this afternoon be possible? I understand this is short notice, but given the circumstances, I believe time may be of significant importance. I looked out the train window as we pulled into Hartford's Union Station. The platform was busy with the usual mix of commuters and travelers, people who knew where they were going and had the resources to get there. Yes, I said, this afternoon works. Excellent. I'll arrange for our Manhattan office to expect you at 3 o'clock. The address is 280 Park Avenue, 32nd floor. Ask for Jennifer Walsh. She'll be coordinating from our end. As the train pulled to a stop, I gathered my suitcases and prepared to step into a world that had shifted fundamentally in the space of a single phone call. The morning had begun with exile and ended with the discovery of wealth I never knew existed. But as I walked through Hartford's small but bustling station, one question echoed through my mind above all others. If my parents had been receiving trust communications for 15 years, what else had they been hiding? The Grand Continental Hotel in downtown Hartford had the kind of understated elegance that whispered money rather than shouting it. I stood in the marble lobby, still wearing the same clothes I'd put on that morning in my childhood bedroom, my 2 suitcases flanked beside me like loyal dogs. The contrast between my circumstances and my surroundings felt almost comical, except nothing about this day had been remotely funny. The concierge, a distinguished man named Giovanni with silver at his temples, and the kind of patient smile that came from years of dealing with travelers in various states of distress, approached my hesitation with professional grace. "May I assist you with check-in, miss?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough warmth to feel genuine without being presumptuous. "I need a room for tonight," I said, suddenly aware of how that sounded coming from someone with luggage that suggested a longer stay. "Maybe longer, I'm not entirely sure." He nodded as if uncertainty were the most natural thing in the world. "We can certainly arrange a flexible booking. Would a junior suite work for your needs?" The price he quoted made me wince internally, but with Klaus Brenner's revelation still echoing in my mind, I found myself nodding. If what he'd told me was true, if there really was an $8.7 million trust fund, with my name on it, then one night in a decent hotel wouldn't bankrupt me, and if it wasn't true, well, I'd figure out the consequences later. Giovanni handled the check-in process with the efficiency of someone who understood that sometimes people needed a safe place to land before they figured out their next move. He didn't ask questions about why I was traveling light with heavy luggage, didn't comment on the fact that I paid in cash from Linda's envelope, and when he handed me the keycard, He included a small card with the hotel's business center hours. "In case you need to make any important calls or arrangements," he said with a slight smile that suggested he'd seen this particular kind of crisis before. The elevator ride to the 8th floor gave me my first moment of genuine solitude since the morning's disaster. I watched the floor numbers climb and tried to process the sheer impossibility of what Klaus had told me, $8.7 million. The figure felt like a foreign language, something that belonged to other people in other circumstances. The room was exactly what I'd expected from a hotel that charged accordingly: clean lines, neutral colors, a view of Hartford's modest skyline that somehow managed to feel both urban and comforting. I set my suitcases by the window and sat heavily on the bed, finally allowing myself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. My phone buzzed with another message from Tyler. "Jessica thinks you're being dramatic. We all know you'll be back within a week asking for help." This time, I didn't delete it immediately. Instead, I screenshot it and saved it to a folder I decided to call evidence. If Klaus was right about the trust fund, if my parents had been intercepting communications about my inheritance for years, then Tyler's casual cruelty was about to become much more expensive for him than he realized. I ordered room service, partly because I was hungry and partly because I wanted to feel what it was like to spend money on myself, without calculating the impact on everyone else's needs first. When the server arrived with a club sandwich and fresh fruit that probably cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a week, I tipped him generously from what remained of Linda's guilt money. At exactly 2:15, I took a cab to Hartford's Amtrak station to catch the train to New York. The afternoon journey down the coast gave me time to think, to plan, and to start constructing a mental framework for what might be about to happen. If Klaus was legitimate, if the trust fund was real, then my entire understanding of my family dynamics was about to shift in ways I couldn't fully anticipate. The Credit Suisse office at 280 Park Avenue occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that scraped against New York's perpetually gray October sky. The elevator that carried me to the 32nd floor was filled with the kind of people who looked like they made significant financial decisions before lunch and international ones before dinner. Jennifer Walsh met me in the reception area, a woman in her early 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations involving large sums of money and complicated family dynamics. Her handshake was firm, her smile professional but not unkind, and she led me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Klaus briefed me on your situation," she said, as we settled at a polished conference table. "Before we proceed, I want to verify that you're comfortable discussing confidential financial information in this setting." "I'm comfortable," I said, though comfortable felt like an inadequate word for what I was experiencing. She opened a leather portfolio and spread several documents across the table's surface. "The Helen Morrison Trust was established on March 15, 1987, with your grandmother as the settlor, an initial funding of $2.3 million. Over the past 36 years, through careful investment management and compound growth, the trust assets have grown to their current value." She pointed to a summary sheet that showed the progression of values over time. The numbers marched steadily upward, interrupted occasionally by market downturns, but resuming their climb with the patience of money that had time to wait. The trust terms specify that distributions begin on your 28th birthday, which occurred on September 23 of this year. The initial distribution of $800,000 was meant to be followed by quarterly payments of $200,000 thereafter. $800,000 that should have arrived a month ago, $200,000 that should start flowing every 3 months for the rest of my life. The mathematics of financial security spread out before me in neat columns and professional typography. "The interesting aspect of this trust," Jennifer continued, "is that your grandmother included very specific language about communication and oversight. She was concerned about family interference, so she structured the documentation to require direct contact with the beneficiary once you reached majority age." She pulled out a manila folder thick with correspondence. "These are copies of every letter, statement, and notification we've sent to 847 Oak Ridge Drive over the past 10 years. As you can see, they're addressed directly to you, not to your parents or guardians." I flipped through the stack with growing disbelief. Letter after letter, statement after statement, all bearing my name, all sent to the house where I'd lived on and off for most of my adult life, annual summaries showing the trust's growth, quarterly statements detailing investment performance, notification letters about upcoming distribution schedules. I never saw any of these, I said, my voice sounding strange in the conference room's acoustics. Jennifer's expression remained carefully neutral, but I caught something in her eyes that might have been sympathy mixed with professional concern. That presents some significant complications, legally speaking. The trust terms require that beneficiaries be kept informed of their assets and have the opportunity to provide input on major investment decisions. She pulled out another document, this one bearing official letterhead and multiple signatures. This is a beneficiary acknowledgement form that we received 18 months ago, allegedly signed by you, stating that you preferred to have all trust communications handled through your family's attorney rather than directly. The signature at the bottom was a decent approximation of mine, close enough to pass casual inspection, but wrong in ways that made my stomach turn. The spacing was off, the pressure inconsistent, the loops in my letters slightly malformed. I didn't sign this, I said. I was beginning to suspect as much, Jennifer replied. The communication patterns never quite matched what we typically see from engaged beneficiaries. Most people who inherit substantial assets have questions, want updates, request meetings. We haven't heard from you directly until today. She gathered the documents back into neat stacks, her movements precise and methodical. Rebecca, what I'm about to tell you is both good news and potentially very complicated news. The good news is that you are absolutely entitled to every dollar in this trust, plus accumulated interest on distributions that should have already been made. The complicated news is that someone has been actively intercepting your correspondence and forging your signature on legal documents. The room felt suddenly airless despite its spacious dimensions and excellent ventilation system. What does that mean legally? It means we have evidence of mail theft and document fraud, both of which are federal crimes. It also means that you have grounds for civil litigation against whoever has been intercepting these communications. She paused, studying my expression. In most cases like this, the interference comes from family members who have financial motivations for keeping beneficiaries unaware of their assets. Family members, my parents, who'd spent the morning lecturing me about financial responsibility while sitting on documentation of my multi-million-dollar inheritance. Tyler, who'd casually mentioned grandmother's trust fund as if I should have known about it, then acted surprised when I didn't. What happens now? I asked. Jennifer pulled out a tablet and began navigating through what appeared to be a complex digital interface. First, we'll need to verify your identity through multiple channels and update all account security protocols. Then we'll initiate the distribution process that should have begun last month. Finally, we'll need to discuss how you want to handle the legal implications of the document fraud. The identity verification process took nearly an hour, involving everything from passport confirmation to questions about my personal history that only I would know. When it was complete, Jennifer handed me a temporary debit card linked to a new account. There's $50,000 available immediately for your expenses while we process the larger distributions, she said. The full $800,000 from your initial distribution should be available within 48 hours, and will also
calculate interest on the delayed payment. $50,000 available immediately. I stared at the piece of plastic in my hand as if it might evaporate if I looked away. Rebecca, Jennifer said gently, I know this is overwhelming. Would you like me to arrange for you to speak with one of our wealth management advisors? When someone suddenly has access to substantial assets, especially in circumstances like these, it can be helpful to have professional guidance. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. She made a quick phone call, and within minutes, a man in his 50s joined us in the conference room. Michael Torres had the kind of calm competence that probably came from helping people navigate financial windfalls and disasters with equal professionalism. The most important thing right now, he said after Jennifer briefed him on my situation, is that you don't make any major decisions while you're processing all of this information. Sudden wealth can be just as disorienting as sudden loss, and family financial conflicts add another layer of complexity. He pulled out a simple notebook and began sketching what he called a stability framework. For the next 30 days, focus on securing your immediate needs: safe housing, reliable transportation, legal representation. If you decide to pursue the document fraud issue, don't make any large purchases or investments. Don't lend money to family members or friends. Don't try to solve everyone's problems with your new resources. The advice felt both practical and slightly absurd. 3 hours ago, I'd been worried about affording dinner. Now I was being counseled against impulse buying yachts or funding other people's business ventures. What about my family? I asked. Do they know that I'm here, that I've found out about the trust? Jennifer and Michael exchanged a look that suggested they'd navigated similar family dramas before. Not from us, Jennifer said. Client confidentiality is absolute. However, when we initiate the distribution process, there will be administrative notifications sent to various parties involved in the trust's management. It's possible that your family's attorney might receive some of that correspondence. How long do I have before they find out? Probably a few days, maybe a week, Michael said. Long enough for you to get your bearings and decide how you want to handle the situation. As the meeting concluded, Jennifer handed me a portfolio containing copies of all the trust documentation, account summaries, and contact information for my new financial team. Rebecca, I want you to understand something important. This money was always yours. Your grandmother intended for you to have it, structured the trust specifically to provide for your independence and security. Whatever family dynamics led to this situation, they don't change the fundamental fact that you are the rightful beneficiary of these assets. The train ride back to Hartford passed in a blur of autumn landscape and mental recalibration. I clutched the portfolio in my lap like a life preserver, occasionally opening it to confirm that the documents were real, that the numbers were actually printed on official letterhead in professional fonts. Back at the Grand Continental, Giovanni greeted me with the same professional warmth he'd shown earlier, but something in his expression suggested he'd noticed a change in my demeanor. I hope your business in the city was productive, Miss Morrison, he said. It was illuminating, I replied, and left it at that. In my hotel room, I spread all the trust documents across the bed and began reading through them systematically. The legal language was dense and formal, but certain phrases jumped out with startling clarity. Your grandmother's deep affection for you and confidence in your character. Provisions to ensure your independence from family influence. Specific instructions that all communications be handled directly with the beneficiary to prevent interference from other parties. Helen Morrison, my grandmother, had known something, had anticipated that her son and daughter-in-law might try to control or manipulate the inheritance she'd intended for me. She'd built safeguards into the trust specifically to prevent the kind of interference that had been happening for the past decade. I thought about her final years, spent in the elegant assisted living facility that Frank had selected for her comfort and convenience. She'd always seemed sharp, aware, fully capable of managing her own affairs until nearly the end. Had she suspected that her son was intercepting my trust correspondence? Had she tried to contact me directly and been told that I wasn't interested in maintaining a relationship? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them, each one leading to darker possibilities about how long the deception had been going on, and how many opportunities for connection with my grandmother had been stolen from both of us. My phone rang, interrupting the spiral of speculation. Tyler's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something about the timing felt significant. Rebecca, where are you? His voice carried an edge of anxiety that I'd rarely heard before. Mom said you left this morning and nobody's heard from you since. I'm fine, I said evenly. I'm in Hartford. Hartford? Why? Look, if this is about this morning, maybe we were a little harsh. You know how Mom gets when she's worried about your future. The casual revisionism was breathtaking. Tyler, tell me about grandmother's trust fund. Silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of everything he wasn't saying. What about it? Tell me how much money is in it. Tell me when distributions are supposed to start. Tell me why I've never seen any documentation about an inheritance that apparently has my name on it. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into the careful tone he used when he was trying to manage a situation he couldn't control. Rebecca, I think there might be some confusion about how these financial arrangements work. Maybe you should come home so we can all sit down and discuss this properly. I'm not coming home, I said. In fact, I don't think 847 Oak Ridge Drive is going to be home for any of us much longer. What's that supposed to mean? I looked out my hotel window at Hartford's evening lights, feeling something like calm settling over me for the first time all day. It means I had a very interesting conversation with Klaus Brenner today, and Jennifer Walsh, and Michael Torres. It means I know about Credit Suisse, and the Helen Morrison Trust, and the $8.7 million that's been sitting there waiting for me while you all convinced me I was a financial burden. The silence that followed was different from his earlier pauses. This was the silence of someone whose carefully constructed narrative had just collapsed. Rebecca, listen, there are complexities to these family financial arrangements that you don't understand. I understand that someone's been forging my signature on legal documents. I interrupted. I understand that mail theft is a federal crime. I understand that grandmother specifically structured the trust to prevent exactly the kind of interference that's been going on for years. You're making a mistake, Tyler said, his voice gaining volume. You're going to destroy this family over money that you don't even need. You've been fine without it, haven't you? The audacity of the argument was stunning. I've been fine because I didn't know what I was missing. There's a difference between choosing simplicity and having your choices stolen from you. Mom and Dad were protecting you. From what? From financial security, from independence, from the ability to make my own decisions about my own life. I stood up, pacing to the window and back. Tyler, they kicked me out this morning. They literally put my belongings in suitcases and told me I had until Sunday to find somewhere else to live. That's not protection, that's control, and it's cruel, and it's over. He tried several more approaches, appeals to family loyalty, warnings about the complexities of sudden wealth, suggestions that I was being manipulated by financial advisors who didn't understand our family dynamics. Each argument felt increasingly desperate, increasingly disconnected from the reality of what had been done to me. Finally, I cut him off. Tyler, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Did you know that I was supposed to be receiving trust distributions starting last month? It's complicated. It's not complicated. Did you know or didn't you? A pause. Then yes. The simple admission hit harder than all his elaborate justifications. How long have you known? Since I turned 28. Dad showed me the documentation when I started getting my distributions. Your distributions. Rebecca, the trust covers all of us. It's not just your money. I pulled out the trust documents Jennifer had given me, flipping to the beneficiary section. Tyler, I'm looking at the official trust documents right now. My name is the only name listed as primary beneficiary. There's no mention of you anywhere in these papers. That can't be right. It's exactly right. Grandmother's trust was set up specifically for me, with specific instructions to prevent family interference. Whatever money you've been receiving, it's not coming from the Helen Morrison Trust. Another silence, this one filled with what sounded like papers rustling in the background. I need to call you back, Tyler said abruptly, and hung up. I sat on the bed, surrounded by documentation that painted a picture of deception so systematic and long-running that it felt almost impressive in its audacity. My parents hadn't just hidden my inheritance, they'd apparently created a fictional version of it that somehow included Tyler as a beneficiary. They'd intercepted my mail, forged my signature, and spent years convincing everyone, including Tyler, that the trust was a family asset rather than my personal inheritance. The hotel room phone rang, startling me out of my analysis. The front desk informed me that I had a visitor asking to come up, Uncle David Morrison. David was Frank's younger brother, a man who'd always seemed slightly out of place at family gatherings. Where Frank projected corporate authority and calculated charm, David had the rumpled authenticity of someone who'd chosen teaching high school history over joining the family business. He'd been kind to me growing up, but we'd rarely spoken one-on-one about anything more significant than my school projects or college plans. When I opened the hotel room door, his expression was a mixture of concern and something that might have been guilt. "Rebecca, Tyler called me. He said you'd found some documents that were causing confusion about family financial arrangements." I stepped aside to let him in, noting how his eyes immediately went to the trust papers spread across the bed. "Uncle David, did you know about grandmother's trust fund?" He sat heavily in the room's single chair, suddenly looking older than his 53 years. "Helen made me promise not to interfere. She said if anything happened to the original plan, if there were problems with communications or distributions, that she wanted the situation to resolve itself naturally." "What was the original plan?" "That you'd receive the trust documentation directly when you turned 18, with distributions starting at 28. She was very specific about the timing, about keeping it separate from the family business, about ensuring your independence." He rubbed his forehead as if trying to massage away a persistent headache. "When you turned 18, and there was no mention of the trust, I assumed Helen had changed her mind, maybe restructured things differently. Then when you turned 28 last month, and still nothing, I started asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "I called Helen's attorney, the one who'd handled the original trust documents. He told me that all communications were being managed through your family's current legal counsel, that you'd requested the arrangement to maintain privacy." I showed him the forged beneficiary acknowledgement form, pointing to the signature that almost but not quite matched my handwriting. David studied it for a long moment, his expression darkening. "This is not good, Rebecca. This is mail fraud, identity theft, potentially embezzlement if they've been accessing funds that weren't theirs. What should I do?" He looked at the documents spread across the bed, then at me, then back at the papers. "Honestly, I think you should talk to a lawyer who specializes in financial fraud before you make any other moves. This situation has criminal implications that go beyond family drama." "Will you help me find one?" "I'll make some calls tonight," he promised. "Rebecca, I'm sorry, I should have pushed harder when things didn't add up. I should have found a way to contact you directly instead of assuming that silence meant consent." After he left, I ordered dinner from room service again, partly because I was hungry and partly because I was beginning to understand that I could afford to make choices based on convenience rather than cost. The freedom of that realization was almost as disorienting as everything else that had happened. I spent the evening reading through every document in the portfolio, taking notes, creating a timeline of when things should have happened versus what had actually occurred. By the time I finally fell asleep, I had the beginning of a clear picture of a deception that had cost me not just money, but years of potential independence, security, and connection with my grandmother during her final years. Tomorrow, I would start the process of reclaiming not just my inheritance, but my right to make my own choices about my own life. Tonight, for the first time in years, I fell asleep knowing that I had the resources to fight back. The law office of Patricia Walsh occupied the 15th floor of a downtown Hartford building that had probably been impressive in the 1980s, but now carried the slightly worn dignity of a place where serious work happened without unnecessary fanfare. Uncle David had arranged the appointment through a colleague who specialized in financial crimes, and Patricia herself had agreed to see me on short notice after he'd outlined the basic facts of my situation. She was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made her seem fully present in every conversation. Her office walls were lined with legal texts and framed diplomas, but also family photos and a small collection of what appeared to be handmade pottery, suggesting someone who understood the importance of life beyond billable hours. "David Morrison gave me the general outline of your situation," she said as we settled into chairs arranged around a small conference table, "but I'd like to hear the details directly from you, starting from the beginning." I walked her through the timeline methodically: the morning eviction, Klaus Brenner's phone call, the discovery of the intercepted correspondence, the forged signature on the beneficiary acknowledgement form. Patricia took notes in a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, amounts, and specific documentation. When I finished, she set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. Rebecca, what you're describing constitutes several federal crimes: mail theft, wire fraud, identity theft, and potentially money laundering if funds from the trust were diverted to unauthorized accounts. The fact that this appears to have been ongoing for over a decade makes it particularly serious. She pulled out a manila folder and began organizing the documents I'd brought. The good news is that you have excellent documentation of the crimes: the forged signature, the intercepted correspondence, the trust documents showing clear beneficiary designations. All of this creates a very strong case. What about the family aspect? I asked. These are my parents, my brother. Is there any way to resolve this without destroying everyone? Patricia's expression softened slightly. I understand the complexity of prosecuting family members. It's never easy to pursue legal action against people you love, even when they've committed serious crimes against you. But I want you to understand something important. By intercepting your inheritance and forging your signature, your family didn't just steal money from you. They stole years of financial security, independence, and choices. They stole your ability to help your grandmother during her final years, your ability to pursue education or career opportunities, your ability to live your life on your own terms. She paused, studying my expression. The question isn't whether what they did was wrong. It absolutely was wrong, and it was criminal. The question is what you want to do about it now that you know. What are my options? Broadly speaking, you have 3 paths forward. First, you can pursue full criminal prosecution, which would involve federal authorities and could result in significant jail time for everyone involved. Second, you can pursue civil litigation to recover damages and establish a legal record of the fraud without involving criminal charges. Third, you can handle this privately through restitution agreements and family negotiations. She spread several documents across the table. Each approach has advantages and disadvantages. Criminal prosecution would send the strongest message and ensure that this kind of fraud is properly penalized, but it would also be public, lengthy, and emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Civil litigation gives you more control over the process and focuses on financial recovery rather than punishment. Private resolution is fastest and maintains family privacy, but it also risks the perception that this kind of behavior is acceptable. What would you recommend? Honestly, I'd recommend starting with civil litigation and keeping criminal prosecution as an option if they're not cooperative. The evidence is so strong that any reasonable attorney would advise your family to settle quickly rather than risk a trial, and if they choose to fight rather than negotiate, then criminal prosecution becomes a much more viable option. She pulled out a calendar and began calculating timelines. If we file a civil suit within the next week, we can probably have preliminary hearings scheduled before Thanksgiving. Given the straightforward nature of the documentation, I'd expect this to resolve fairly quickly, either through settlement or summary judgment. How quickly? Probably 60 to 90 days if they're reasonable, longer if they decide to be difficult. She looked up from her notes. Rebecca, I have to ask, are you prepared for your family to fight this? Because once we file papers, there's no pretending this is a misunderstanding or a communication problem. They'll know that you know, and they'll have to decide whether to admit fault or try to defend the indefensible. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't quite started yet. Was I prepared for my family to fight this? Was I prepared for Frank to hire expensive attorneys and claim that he'd been acting in my best interests? Was I prepared for Linda to cry and say she'd never intended to hurt me? Was I prepared for Tyler to argue that family money should be handled by the family, regardless of what legal documents said? I'm prepared, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I'm prepared because I finally understand that they've been fighting me all along, I just didn't know it. Patricia nodded as if I'd passed some kind of test. Then let's talk about strategy. The first thing we need to do is secure all of your assets and establish independent legal control over your finances. Right now, your family still has access to your mail, which means they might try to interfere with trust communications or banking relationships. She handed me a checklist of immediate action items: change my address with the Postal Service, open new bank accounts with different institutions, establish secure communication protocols with Credit Suisse, document any attempts at contact or intimidation from family members. The second thing we need to do is calculate damages. This isn't just about the money you should have received, it's about interest on those funds, investment opportunities you missed, educational or professional opportunities that financial security would have enabled, emotional distress, and punitive damages for the deliberate nature of the fraud. How much are we talking about? Patricia pulled out a calculator and began working through rough estimates. The trust distributions alone, with interest, probably exceed $1 million. Lost investment opportunities could easily double that. Punitive damages in fraud cases like this often equal or exceed actual damages. We're probably looking at a total claim in the $3 to $5 million range. $3 to $5 million. The number felt both enormous and somehow insufficient. How do you put a price on years of feeling like a burden? How do you calculate the cost of missed opportunities that you never knew you'd missed? There's one more thing we need to discuss, Patricia said, her tone becoming more serious. Your family is going to argue that they were protecting you, that you were too young or inexperienced to handle substantial wealth, that they were following your grandmother's true intentions, even if not her written instructions. They're going to paint this as a family misunderstanding rather than criminal fraud. How do we counter that? With the documents, your grandmother was very specific about wanting you to have direct control and communication. She anticipated exactly this kind of interference and built safeguards against it. The forged signature on the beneficiary acknowledgement form proves that they knew they were acting against your interests and chose to deceive rather than communicate. She gathered the papers back into organized stacks. Rebecca, I want you to go home tonight and think about what you really want to achieve with this legal action. Is it primarily about recovering the money? Is it about establishing accountability for what they did? Is it about ensuring this never happens to anyone else in your family? The clearer you are about your goals, the better I can structure our approach. I want all of those things, then we'll pursue all of those things. She stood and walked to her office window, looking out at Hartford's afternoon traffic. One final question: do you have somewhere safe to stay while this plays out? Family financial conflicts can get very ugly very quickly, and people who are desperate to avoid consequences sometimes make poor decisions about intimidation or manipulation. I thought about the Grand Continental, about Giovanni's professional discretion, and the security of a place where my family couldn't simply show up unannounced. I have a hotel room for now, I'll need something more permanent eventually. Good. And Rebecca, document everything, every phone call, every text message, every attempt at contact. If they try to convince you to drop this, if they make threats, if they try to paint you as ungrateful or unstable, we need records of all of it. The walk back to my hotel took me through downtown Hartford's modest business district, past office buildings and restaurants, where people were ending their workdays with the normal concerns of normal lives. I envied them their simplicity, their ability to worry about traffic and dinner plans instead of federal fraud charges and family destruction. Back in my hotel room, I called Jennifer Walsh at Credit Suisse to update her on the legal situation and arrange for enhanced security protocols on my accounts. She was unsurprised by the developments and professionally supportive of my decision to pursue legal action. We see this more often than you might think, she said. Family financial fraud is unfortunately common, especially in cases involving substantial inherited wealth. The good news is that your grandmother's documentation is extremely thorough, which makes it very difficult for anyone to claim confusion about her intentions. Jennifer, can you tell me more about my grandmother's final years? Did she ever try to contact me directly? A pause, followed by the sound of papers rustling. Actually, yes, we have records of several calls she made to our client services department asking about trust communications. She was concerned that she hadn't heard from you after you turned 21, and again after you turned 25. Each time, we confirmed that all correspondence was being sent to the designated address. What did she think was happening? Initially, she assumed you were busy with college and career development and simply weren't prioritizing financial planning. But in her final year, she specifically requested that we attempt direct contact with you by phone. We made several attempts, but the number on file was disconnected. My childhood phone number, the one I'd used through high school and college before switching to my own plan. My parents would have known that calls to that number wouldn't reach me, but they'd never updated Credit Suisse with my current information. She died thinking I wasn't interested in maintaining a relationship with her, I said. I'm afraid that's possible, Jennifer replied gently, but Rebecca, from our perspective, it's clear that she never stopped caring about you or wanting to ensure your security. The trust structure she created is extremely generous and specifically designed to provide for your independence. Whatever family dynamics prevented normal communication, her financial planning demonstrates consistent love and concern for your well-being. After hanging up, I sat on the hotel bed and tried to imagine those final conversations between my grandmother and Credit Suisse, Helen Morrison, growing older and more concerned, wondering why her granddaughter had never acknowledged the trust fund or expressed interest in building a relationship around their shared financial planning. Credit Suisse, professional and patient, confirming that all proper procedures were being followed while having no way to know that the correspondence was being intercepted. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Jessica, Tyler's wife. I think you should know that your parents are planning to contest the trust. They're claiming Helen wasn't mentally competent when she structured it. I stared at the message for several minutes before responding. Do you have any evidence of this? I overheard Frank on the phone with their lawyer. They're going to argue that the trust was created during a period when Helen was experiencing cognitive decline, and that she intended for the money to be managed by Frank as executor. The audacity was breathtaking. Not only had they stolen my inheritance, but now they were planning to attack my grandmother's mental competence to justify their actions. The woman who'd built a multi-million-dollar trust fund with sophisticated anti-interference provisions, who'd maintained her independence and decision-making capacity until nearly the end of her life, who'd anticipated exactly this kind of family conflict and planned accordingly. Why are you telling me this? I texted back, because I've been married to Tyler for 3 years, and I've seen how this family operates. What they did to you was wrong, and now they're doubling down instead of apologizing. You deserve to know what you're up against. Another text arrived a few minutes later. Also, I found some documents in Tyler's home office that you
might want to see. I took photos. The photos showed bank statements from an account I'd never seen before, listing monthly deposits from something called Morrison Family Trust Administration. The amounts were substantial, $5,000 monthly for the past 18 months, with a note indicating the payments were beneficiary distributions pending final allocation. Tyler had been receiving money that he believed was coming from the same trust fund that should have been sending distributions to me. My parents had apparently created some kind of parallel financial structure that convinced him he was receiving legitimate inheritance payments while systematically stealing mine. Jessica, where is this money coming from? I don't know. Tyler always said it was family trust money that would eventually be formalized, but he was vague about the details. I assumed it had something to do with your grandmother's estate planning. The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing. My parents hadn't just intercepted my inheritance, they'd used it to fund payments to Tyler that made him complicit in the fraud without necessarily knowing he was participating in a crime. They'd managed to steal from me while simultaneously manipulating him into feeling entitled to money that was never his. I forwarded the photos to Patricia Walsh, with a note explaining the context. Within an hour, she called me back. Rebecca, this changes things significantly. If your parents have been diverting trust funds to unauthorized recipients, that's embezzlement on top of the fraud charges. And if Tyler was receiving money while knowing that you weren't, that potentially makes him a co-conspirator. What if he didn't know the money was coming from my trust? That's possible, but it's also his responsibility to verify the source of funds he's receiving. Either way, these bank statements establish a clear paper trail of misappropriated trust assets, which strengthens our case considerably. She paused, and I could hear her typing notes. I'm going to recommend that we accelerate our timeline. If your parents are already consulting attorneys about contesting the trust, they're probably also trying to cover their tracks or create alternative explanations for their actions. We need to file our suit and freeze assets before they can muddy the waters further. How quickly can we move? I can have papers filed by Friday if you're ready to proceed. That gives us 3 days to finalize our damage calculations and ensure we have complete documentation. Do it. That evening, I ordered dinner from a restaurant that Patricia had mentioned during our meeting, a small Italian place that delivered to the hotel. The food was excellent, and for the first time since this entire situation began, I found myself actually tasting what I was eating instead of mechanically consuming fuel while my mind processed crisis. As I ate, I composed a mental letter to my grandmother, the conversation we should have had during her final years. I would have told her about my work, my relationships, my dreams for the future. I would have asked her about her childhood, her marriage, her experiences as a woman building wealth in a time when that was less common. I would have thanked her for thinking of my independence and security, for understanding that love sometimes means giving people the tools to succeed without interference. Instead, she died thinking I was indifferent to her efforts, uninterested in the legacy she'd tried to create for me. That loss felt almost as significant as the financial theft, and certainly more permanent. My phone rang just as I was finishing dinner. Linda's name appeared on the screen and I debated whether to answer. Finally, curiosity won. "Rebecca, sweetheart, Tyler told me about your conversation last night." Her voice carried the kind of careful warmth that suggested a rehearsed approach. "I think there's been some confusion about family financial arrangements, and I'd love to sit down and explain how things actually work." "There's no confusion, Mom. I know about the Helen Morrison Trust. I know about the intercepted mail. I know about the forged signature on the beneficiary acknowledgement form." A pause, followed by what sounded like a sharp intake of breath. "Oh, honey, I think someone's been giving you misleading information. You know how complicated these legal documents can be, especially for people who aren't familiar with estate planning." The condescension was stunning. Even now, even with evidence of systematic fraud, she was talking to me like I was a confused child who couldn't understand basic financial concepts. "I've spent 2 days with private banking specialists and attorneys who specialize in financial fraud," I said evenly. "I understand the legal documents perfectly. What I don't understand is how you thought you could keep intercepting my mail forever. Rebecca, please don't let strangers turn you against your family. We've always acted in your best interests, even when you couldn't see it. Sometimes parents have to make difficult decisions to protect their children." Protect me from what? From financial security, from independence, from the ability to help my grandmother during her final years. "Your grandmother was very sick toward the end," Linda said, her voice becoming sharper. "She wasn't thinking clearly about financial planning. The trust arrangements she made didn't reflect her true intentions or what was best for the family as a whole. She was mentally competent when she created the trust, and she was mentally competent when she specified that all communications should go directly to me. Her attorney confirmed that yesterday." Another pause, longer this time. When Linda spoke again, the warmth had completely disappeared from her voice. "I hope you understand what you're doing, Rebecca. Families can survive financial disagreements, but they can't survive betrayal. If you choose to pursue this with lawyers and accusations, you'll be choosing strangers over family. That's a decision you'll have to live with for the rest of your life." "I've already been living with the consequences of your decisions for the rest of my life," I replied. "Now I'm finally in a position to make my own." I hung up before she could respond, then immediately called Patricia Walsh to report the conversation. "She's trying to establish a record of offering to negotiate," Patricia said after I'd recounted the call. "It's a common tactic in family fraud cases. They know they're about to be sued, so they want to be able to claim they tried to resolve things amicably. What should I do if they call again? Don't answer. Any communication from this point forward should go through attorneys. If they try to contact you directly, document it but don't engage. The time for family conversations is over. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that despite everything happening around me, I felt calmer than I had in months. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by clarity about what needed to happen and confidence that I had the resources to make it happen. Tomorrow, Patricia would file the lawsuit that would officially begin the process of reclaiming not just my inheritance, but my right to make decisions about my own life without interference from people who claim to love me while systematically undermining my independence. For the first time in years, I fell asleep knowing exactly what I was fighting for and exactly how I was going to win. The Hartford Superior Court building stood against a November sky that matched the gray limestone of its facade, a monument to justice that felt appropriately solemn for what was about to unfold inside its chambers. I walked up the wide steps with Patricia Walsh beside me, her briefcase containing 3 months of preparation that would finally force my family to confront the consequences of their deception. The weeks following our initial filing had brought exactly the kind of desperate maneuvering Patricia had predicted. Frank had hired Whitmore, Patterson and Associates, a firm known for defending wealthy families against uncomfortable accusations. They'd filed motion after motion requests to dismiss based on statute of limitations claims that family financial arrangements were exempt from fraud statutes, demands for psychiatric evaluation of my grandmother's mental state during trust creation. Each motion had been systematically dismantled by Patricia's methodical presentation of evidence. The forged signature, the intercepted correspondence, the unauthorized distributions to Tyler, the detailed testimony from Credit Suisse about my grandmother's specific instructions for direct communication. What had started as my family's confident assertion that they'd been protecting family interests had gradually collapsed into increasingly frantic attempts to avoid accountability. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with dark wood paneling and tall windows that let in thin autumn light. Frank sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, looking older than I remembered but still projecting the kind of authority that had dominated family discussions for decades. Linda sat beside him, her hands folded carefully in her lap, wearing the same expression of wounded dignity she'd perfected during years of charity board meetings. Tyler was notably absent. According to Jessica, who'd become an unexpected source of information about family dynamics, he'd been struggling with the revelation that his monthly payments had been funded by my stolen inheritance. The man who'd spent years lecturing me about financial responsibility had discovered that his own financial security was built on fraud. Judge Margaret Thornton entered with the kind of no-nonsense bearing that suggested she'd seen enough family financial drama to recognize the difference between legitimate disputes and criminal deception. Patricia had warned me that Judge Thornton had a reputation for cutting through emotional manipulation to focus on legal facts, which worked in our favor given the strength of our documentation. This is a civil action for damages resulting from mail fraud, identity theft, and breach of fiduciary duty, Judge Thornton said, reviewing the case summary. The plaintiff alleges that defendants systematically intercepted trust correspondence and forged legal documents to prevent her from accessing inherited assets. The defendants claim they were acting in the plaintiff's best interests according to family tradition and the true intentions of the trust settler. Frank's attorney, a polished man named Charles Whitmore who spoke with the kind of practiced confidence that came from defending difficult cases, stood to present their opening argument. Your Honor, this case represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how multi-generational family wealth is traditionally managed. Helen Morrison, the trust settler, was Robert Morrison's mother. She understood that family financial planning requires coordination and oversight to prevent poor decisions by inexperienced beneficiaries. He gestured toward Frank with the kind of respect reserved for important clients. Robert Morrison has spent decades successfully managing family assets, growing the Morrison import-export business from a small operation to a $15 million enterprise. When his mother created the trust for his daughter, she understood that his guidance would be essential for proper stewardship of those assets. Whitmore. Judge Thornton interrupted. Do you have documentation showing that Helen Morrison intended for her son to manage her granddaughter's trust rather than allowing direct communication as specified in the trust documents? A pause that stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Your Honor, the documentation reflects Mrs. Morrison's formal legal instructions, but family financial planning often involves informal understanding that supplement written agreements. Informal understandings that supersede written legal documents. Judge Thornton's tone suggested she found this argument less than compelling. Patricia stood to present our case, her voice clear and steady as she outlined the timeline of deception. Your Honor, Helen Morrison was extraordinarily specific about her intentions for this trust. She anticipated exactly the kind of family interference that has occurred and built multiple safeguards against it. She approached the evidence table and lifted a thick folder. These are copies of every piece of correspondence sent by Credit Suisse to the Morrison family address between 2013 and 2023. Every letter, every statement, every legal notice addressed directly to Rebecca Morrison and marked for her personal attention. None of this correspondence ever reached her. Judge Thornton accepted the folder and began reviewing the documents, her expression growing more serious with each page. These are addressed specifically to the plaintiff, not to any family representative or guardian. Exactly, Your Honor. And here Patricia continued, producing the forged beneficiary acknowledgement form as evidence that defendants not only intercepted Miss Morrison's mail but actively forged her signature to create false documentation authorizing their interference. She handed the document to a handwriting expert who'd been seated in the gallery, Dr. Sarah Chen from the Connecticut State Police Forensics Laboratory. Dr. Chen had spent 3 days analyzing the signature and preparing testimony that would be difficult for the defense to challenge. Dr. Chen, what did your analysis reveal about this signature? Dr. Chen approached the witness stand with the kind of methodical precision that came from years of providing expert testimony in criminal cases. The signature on this document shows multiple indicators of forgery. The pressure patterns are inconsistent with natural handwriting. The letter spacing doesn't match authenticated samples of Miss Morrison's signature, and microscopic analysis reveals evidence of tracing over pencil guidelines that were later erased. In your professional opinion, did Rebecca Morrison sign this document? Absolutely not. This signature was created by someone attempting to replicate her handwriting, probably using samples from other documents for reference. Frank's face had grown progressively paler during Dr. Chen's testimony. Linda's composed expression was beginning to crack, her hands no longer folded calmly but gripping the edge of the defendant's table. Patricia continued with Klaus Brenner testifying via video link from Zurich about Credit Suisse's attempts to contact me directly and their growing concern about the lack of beneficiary communication. His testimony was particularly damaging because it established that my family had been receiving increasingly urgent requests for direct contact with me while continuing to claim that I preferred indirect communication. Mr. Brenner, did Credit Suisse ever receive any communication directly from Rebecca Morrison prior to October 2023? No, we did not. All communication purportedly from Miss Morrison came through intermediaries, which was unusual for a beneficiary of her age and education level. Most clients want direct contact with their wealth management team. What was Credit Suisse's response to this unusual communication pattern? We made multiple attempts to establish direct contact, including phone calls to numbers on file and requests for in-person meetings. Each attempt was redirected through family representatives who claimed Miss Morrison preferred the existing arrangement. The phone numbers on file, of course, were outdated numbers that my parents knew would no longer reach me. The in-person meeting requests had been deflected with claims that I was too busy with work or uninterested in financial planning. When it came time for Frank to testify, Charles Whitmore had clearly advised him to acknowledge the basic facts while attempting to frame them as protective rather than predatory. Frank approached the witness stand with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the authority in any room, but his confidence was visibly strained. Mr. Morrison, Patricia began, did you receive mail addressed to your daughter Rebecca between 2013 and 2023? I received mail that came to my address, yes. Mail that was specifically addressed to Rebecca Morrison, marked for her personal attention? A pause. Yes. Did you give this mail to your daughter? I reviewed the correspondence to determine whether it required immediate attention or whether it could be handled as part of our overall family financial planning. Mr. Morrison, did your daughter give you permission to open her mail? She was living in my house and understood that family financial matters were handled collectively. Patricia produced phone records showing multiple calls between Frank and Credit Suisse during periods when I was living independently in my own apartment. Morrison, these calls occurred when your daughter was not living in your house. How do you explain intercepting her mail during these periods? Frank's attorney objected, but Judge Thornton allowed the question. Frank's answer was less confident than his previous responses. The trust arrangements were complex and Rebecca didn't have experience with sophisticated financial planning. I was protecting her from making decisions that could have had long-term negative consequences. Mr. Morrison, are you a licensed financial advisor? No. Are you a certified estate planning attorney? No. What qualifications do you have to make financial decisions on behalf of an adult beneficiary who didn't authorize your involvement? The silence that followed was devastating. Frank had no answer because there was no answer. He'd acted without authority, without expertise, and without consent, taking control of assets that belonged to someone else because he believed he knew better than both his daughter and his deceased mother. Patricia's cross-examination of Linda was even more damaging. Linda had been the one actually forging my signature on documents, and her attempts to justify this as helping with paperwork collapsed under scrutiny about specific dates and circumstances. Mrs. Morrison, on March 15, 2021, you signed Rebecca Morrison's name to a document authorizing Credit Suisse to continue indirect communication through family representatives. Where was your daughter on that date? Linda consulted notes her attorney had provided. I believe she was living in her apartment near the university. So she was not present when you signed her name to this legal document? No, but we had discussed financial planning generally as a family. Morrison, do you have any documentation of a conversation where your daughter specifically authorized you to sign legal documents on her behalf? We didn't formalize every family discussion in writing. Because there was no such discussion, was there? You forged your daughter's signature without her knowledge or consent. Linda's composure finally broke. We were trying to protect her from making mistakes that could have ruined her financial security. Sometimes parents have to make difficult decisions for their children's own good. Mrs. Morrison, your daughter was 28 years old when you forged her signature on this document. She was not a child requiring parental protection. She was an adult whose legal rights you violated. The most damaging testimony came from Jennifer Walsh, appearing via video from New York to confirm that Credit Suisse had been extremely concerned about the communication patterns and had specifically recommended direct contact to resolve what they viewed as an unusual and potentially problematic situation. Ms. Walsh, in your professional experience, is it normal for adult beneficiaries to avoid direct contact with wealth management teams? It's extremely unusual. Most clients want regular communication about their assets, especially during the initial distribution period. The lack of direct contact with Miss Morrison was so unusual that we consulted with our legal department about potential compliance issues. What kind of compliance issues? We were concerned that we might be dealing with financial elder abuse or coercion. The communication patterns were consistent with cases where family members are preventing beneficiaries from accessing their assets. Financial elder abuse. The phrase hung in the courtroom like an indictment of everything my family had claimed about protection and care. Credit Suisse hadn't just been confused by the situation, they'd been actively concerned that crimes were being committed. When the defense finally presented their case, it consisted largely of character witnesses testifying to Frank's business acumen and family devotion. Several associates from Morrison Import-Export praised his leadership and financial judgment. Linda's charity board colleagues spoke about her dedication to community service and family values. But character testimony couldn't overcome documentary evidence of forgery and fraud. Charles Whitmore's closing argument was passionate but ultimately irrelevant to the legal questions at hand. Your Honor, Robert Morrison is a successful businessman who has spent decades building family wealth and security. His actions regarding his daughter's trust were motivated by love and concern, not greed or malice. Whatever technical violations may have occurred, they occurred in the context of family financial planning that has successfully preserved and grown assets for multiple generations. Judge Thornton's response was swift and unforgiving. Mr. Whitmore, love and concern do not authorize mail theft and document fraud. Family financial planning does not supersede individual legal rights. The fact that Mr. Morrison may be skilled at managing his own business assets does not give him authority to steal assets that belong to his daughter. Patricia's closing argument was brief and devastating. Your Honor, this case is about one fundamental principle: adults have the right to control their own financial affairs without interference from family members who disagree with their choices. The defendants didn't just steal money from Rebecca Morrison. They stole years of independence, security, and opportunity. They stole her ability to maintain a relationship with her grandmother during her final years. They stole her right to make her own decisions about her own life. Judge Thornton retired for deliberation at 3:15 on a Friday afternoon. By 4:30 she was back with a decision that would reshape my family's understanding of accountability and consequence. I find the defendants liable for mail fraud, identity theft, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The evidence of systematic deception is overwhelming and undeniable. The defendants intercepted mail, forged legal documents, and misappropriated trust assets over a period of more than 10 years. She paused, looking directly at Frank and Linda. The defendants' claims about protection and family tradition are irrelevant to the legal issues before this court. Adults have absolute rights to control their own inherited assets regardless of whether family members approve of their financial decisions. The damages she awarded exceeded even Patricia's optimistic projections: full restitution of intercepted trust distributions with compound interest, punitive damages equal to twice the actual financial losses, reimbursement of legal fees, and an additional award for emotional distress. The total judgment was just over $4 million. But more important than the money was what happened next. Judge Thornton ordered Frank and Linda to surrender all documents related to the trust, prohibited them from any future contact with Credit Suisse or other financial institutions managing my assets, and referred the case to federal prosecutors for potential criminal charges. As we left the courthouse, Frank approached me for the first time since the proceedings began. His face was ashen, his usual confidence completely absent. "Rebecca, I hope you understand that everything we did was because we love you." I looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd raised me, who'd taught me to drive and helped me with math homework and walked me down the aisle at my college graduation. The man who'd also stolen my inheritance, forged my signature, and destroyed my relationship with my grandmother during her final years. "Dad, if this is what your love looks like, I can't afford it anymore." I walked away without looking back, leaving him standing on the courthouse steps with the ruins of his justifications scattered around him like broken glass. The months that followed brought a different kind of challenge: learning to live with sudden wealth while rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by years of systematic deception. Tyler and I eventually found our way to a careful reconciliation based partly on Jessica's testimony about his genuine shock when he learned the source of his monthly payments. He returned every dollar he'd received, though the money was less important than his acknowledgement that he'd been complicit in a system that harmed me. Frank and Linda never acknowledged wrongdoing beyond what was legally required. They paid the judgment, surrendered the documents, and maintained to anyone who would listen that they'd been punished for acting in their daughter's best interests. The federal prosecutors ultimately declined to pursue criminal charges, partly because of their ages and partly because the civil judgment was deemed sufficient deterrent. I used part of the settlement money to establish the Helen Morrison Foundation, focused on financial literacy and elder abuse prevention. It felt like the right way to honor my grandmother's memory while ensuring that other families couldn't weaponize love the way mine had weaponized theirs. The foundation's first project was a program training bank employees to recognize signs of financial coercion and family fraud. Klaus Brenner agreed to serve on the advisory board, bringing expertise from years of managing wealth for complicated families. 6 months after the trial, I bought a house in Hartford's West End, a renovated Victorian with tall windows and a garden where I could grow things that belonged entirely to me. The house had space for an office where I expanded my graphic design work, taking on projects that interested me rather than ones that paid immediately.
The financial security was transformative, but not in the ways I'd expected. Having money didn't make me happier, but it made happiness possible by removing the constant anxiety about basic survival. I could make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford, could take risks in relationships and career without worrying about financial consequences. More importantly, I finally understood what my grandmother had intended when she structured the trust to provide independence rather than just wealth. She'd known that financial security was meaningless without the freedom to make your own mistakes, to learn from your own experiences, to build your own life according to your own values. On the anniversary of that first phone call from Klaus Brenner, I drove to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. Her headstone was simple granite with her name, dates, and a line from a poem she'd loved: "She who would be free must strike the blow." I brought flowers and sat beside her grave for an hour, finally having the conversation we should have had during her lifetime. I told her about the foundation, about the house, about the strange
experience of discovering that love and theft could coexist in the same actions by the same people. Most importantly, I thanked her for understanding that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the tools to succeed without you. She'd known that my parents would try to control my inheritance, and she'd built safeguards that ultimately allowed truth to emerge despite their efforts to bury it. As I prepared to leave, my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Tyler and I are expecting our third baby. We want you to be the godmother." I looked at the message, then at my grandmother's headstone, then at the late afternoon sun filtering through maple trees that had been planted when she was still alive to enjoy their shade. Family, I realized, wasn't defined by blood or shared last names or even shared values. Family was defined by people who chose to see you clearly and love you anyway, who supported your independence rather than demanding your dependence. I typed back, "I would be honored." On the drive home, I thought about the morning 15 months earlier when I'd been kicked out with 2 suitcases and $500 in guilt money. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone who'd spent years accepting crumbs because she didn't know she deserved a feast. The transformation hadn't been about money, though money had made it possible. It had been about understanding that worth didn't depend on other people's recognition, that love without respect was just sophisticated manipulation, that family harmony wasn't worth preserving if it required your silence about your own mistreatment. The house on Oak Ridge Drive where I'd grown up had been sold to pay the judgment. Frank and Linda had moved to a smaller place in West Hartford, their social circle carefully avoiding discussion of why the Morrison family had suddenly needed to liquidate assets. Their comfortable retirement had become significantly less comfortable, but they'd retained enough to maintain basic security and dignity. I felt neither satisfaction nor regret about their reduced circumstances. They'd made choices, and choices had consequences, and that was how the world was supposed to work for everyone rather than just for people without family connections to protect them. As I pulled into my own driveway, I saw Giovanni from the Grand Continental standing on my front porch with a small wrapped package. He'd become an unlikely friend during the months when the hotel had served as my refuge, and we'd maintained contact after I'd moved into permanent housing. "Miss Morrison," he said with the formal courtesy that was his trademark, "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. I brought you something that arrived at the hotel addressed to your old room number." The package was from Credit Suisse, containing the final distribution from the trust's dissolution and a handwritten note from Klaus Brenner. "Dear Rebecca, it has been my privilege to help restore your grandmother's intentions. I hope the foundation brings you as much satisfaction as she intended the trust to provide. With warm regards, Klaus." Inside the package was also a small jewelry box containing a simple gold necklace with a pendant shaped like a key. The accompanying note in handwriting I didn't recognize read, "For the woman who struck the blow. Love, grandmother." I stood on my front porch holding this final gift from a woman who'd died believing I'd forgotten her, who'd somehow found a way to send love across time and death and family interference. The key pendant caught the late afternoon light, sparkling with possibilities I was only beginning to understand.
That evening, I called Patricia Walsh to let her know about the Foundation's latest project, a legal clinic providing free representation to beneficiaries whose families were attempting to control or steal their inheritances. She agreed to serve as supervising attorney, bringing her expertise in financial fraud to help people who couldn't afford to fight back against family manipulation. "Rebecca," she said as our call was ending, "you understand that you've changed more than just your own life with this case. The precedent we established will make it much harder for families to claim protective authority over adult beneficiaries. You've made it safer for other people to stand up for their financial rights." I thought about that as I prepared for bed in my own house, in my own room, surrounded by choices I'd made with resources that belonged unambiguously to me. Somewhere, maybe, there was another Rebecca Morrison getting kicked out with suitcases and guilt money, not yet knowing that the phone call that would change everything was already on its way. The grandfather clock in my living room chimed 11 times, marking the end of another day in a life that finally belonged entirely to me. Outside, November wind moved through bare branches with the sound of changes coming, seasons turning, old things ending to make room for whatever would grow in their place. I fell asleep wearing my grandmother's key pendant, dreaming of doors I hadn't known existed and the courage it would take to open them. 5 years after the courthouse steps confrontation, I stood in a conference room at the Helen Morrison Foundation headquarters, watching afternoon sunlight stream through windows that overlooked downtown Hartford's gradual transformation. The foundation had grown from a modest operation run out of my home office into something that required actual staff, actual infrastructure, and actual strategic planning that extended beyond my initial impulse to help people who'd experienced what I had. Amanda Kelly, the woman I'd hired as executive director 2 years earlier, was presenting quarterly impact metrics to our expanded board. She'd been a financial advisor who'd witnessed too many cases of family wealth manipulation and had jumped at the opportunity to build prevention programs that could reach people before the damage became irreversible. "We've provided direct legal assistance to 43 beneficiaries this quarter," Amanda said, advancing through slides that showed demographics, case outcomes, and financial recoveries. The total amount recovered for clients was just over $12 million, with an average case resolution time of 4 months. $12 million that would have remained in the hands of family members who'd convinced themselves that love justified theft. 43 people who now had the resources to build lives according to their own values rather than their relatives' expectations. Klaus Brenner, attending via video from Zurich, nodded approvingly. "The efficiency improvements are remarkable. When we first discussed this initiative, I estimated 6 to 8 months for typical case resolution. Your legal team has developed protocols that significantly accelerate the process." Patricia Walsh, now serving as the Foundation's general counsel while maintaining her private practice, smiled at the recognition. "We've learned that speed matters enormously in these cases. The longer family members have to construct alternative narratives and move assets, the harder recovery becomes. Getting preliminary injunctions within the first 30 days has proven critical." I listened to the discussion with the kind of detached satisfaction that came from watching something you'd created develop into something larger than your original vision. The foundation had become exactly what my grandmother had probably hoped her trust would enable: a mechanism for transforming personal experience into systemic change. Giovanni, who'd surprised everyone by accepting my invitation to join the board after retiring from the Grand Continental, raised a question about outreach strategies. "Are we reaching people before family dynamics deteriorate beyond repair? Prevention seems more valuable than remediation, even when remediation is successful." It was a question I'd been wrestling with for months. The Foundation's legal clinic was extraordinarily effective at recovering stolen assets and holding family members accountable, but by the time people reached us, relationships were usually damaged beyond any meaningful reconciliation.
Tyler and I had managed a careful detente based on his genuine remorse and Jessica's mediation, but we weren't close in any traditional sense. Frank and Linda remained convinced that they'd been punished for parental devotion, their occasional attempts at reconciliation consisting mainly of suggestions that I was obligated to forgive them because family was family. "That's actually something I wanted to discuss," I said, standing to address the board. "We've been focused primarily on legal intervention, which is necessary and valuable. But Giovanni's right that we should be investing more heavily in prevention through financial literacy programs and early warning systems." I pulled up a proposal I'd been developing with Michael Torres, who'd remained my primary wealth advisor while also contributing pro bono consulting to the foundation. "What if we partnered with banks and wealth management firms to create mandatory beneficiary verification protocols? When trusts reach distribution age, financial institutions would be required to establish direct contact with beneficiaries through multiple independent channels before processing any indirect communication requests." Klaus leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "That would require significant industry cooperation and probably regulatory changes. But the principle is sound. Credit Suisse has actually implemented similar protocols internally after your case highlighted the vulnerabilities in our communication systems." Patricia was already making notes about legislative strategy. "We could start with Connecticut and use that as a model for federal legislation. Financial elder abuse is receiving increased attention in Congress. This fits perfectly into existing policy conversations." The meeting continued for another hour, ranging across topics that would have seemed impossibly sophisticated 5 years earlier when I'd been sitting in a hotel room trying to understand what Klaus Brenner was telling me about offshore accounts and intercepted mail. I'd learned that wealth management wasn't about hoarding resources but about deploying them strategically toward outcomes that mattered. After the board meeting concluded, Jessica arrived with her 3 children, the twins from her marriage to Tyler, now 7 years old, and little Emma, the goddaughter I'd watched grow from infant to kindergartner. The kids scattered immediately toward the foundation's small library, drawn by the promise of new books and the elaborate fish tank that had become an unexpected highlight of office visits. "Tyler wanted me to tell you that he's grateful for the college fund you established for the kids," Jessica said as we settled into my office with coffee. "He's still too proud to say it directly, but the gratitude is genuine." The college fund had been one of my first major financial decisions after the settlement, ensuring that Tyler's children would have educational security regardless of their father's complicated feelings about accepting help from the sister whose inheritance he'd unknowingly helped steal. Emma's fund was even larger, a godmother's investment in possibilities that were only beginning to unfold. "How is he doing?" I asked, "really doing, not the version he presents at family events." Jessica considered the question carefully. She'd become something like a friend over the years, though our relationship had the permanent awkwardness of being built on her husband's complicity in his parents' fraud. "He's still processing the guilt. The therapy helps, but he carries this weight of understanding that his financial security for years was built on your stolen money. It's not something that just goes away." I never blamed him for not knowing. "I know, but he blames himself for not questioning where the money was coming from, for accepting his parents' explanations without demanding documentation, for believing that you were just bad with money rather than being systematically deprived of resources." She paused, watching her children through the glass wall that separated my office from the library. "The hardest part for him is understanding that love and harm aren't mutually exclusive. That his parents could genuinely believe they were protecting family interests while actively destroying their daughter's financial security and independence. It was a tension I'd been exploring in therapy for years, the reality that Frank and Linda probably did love me in their limited conditional way while simultaneously stealing from me and forging my signature and intercepting communications from my dying grandmother. People were capable of remarkable cognitive dissonance when their self-image required it. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Your father is in the hospital. Heart attack.
Linda wanted me to let you know. I stared at the message for several seconds, feeling the complicated mix of concern and detachment that characterized my relationship with my parents. We'd been cordial at family events, exchanged cards on appropriate holidays, maintained the minimum contact necessary to avoid being labeled completely estranged. But there was no real relationship, just a performance of one for people who found family dysfunction uncomfortable. "Everything okay?" Jessica asked, noticing my expression. "Frank had a heart attack. He's in the hospital. Are you going to visit?" The question hung between us, weighted with implications about duty and forgiveness and whether enough time had passed to transform theft into something that could be set aside in moments of medical crisis. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Part of me thinks I should, because he's my father and he's sick and family is supposed to show up during emergencies. Another part of me remembers standing in front of Judge Thornton while his lawyer argued that stealing my inheritance was an act of love." Jessica nodded slowly. "There's no right answer to this. Whatever you decide, it says more about who you are than who he is." I looked out my office window at Hartford's skyline, thinking about the person I'd been 5 years ago, desperate for family approval, willing to accept crumbs rather than demand the respect I deserved, convinced that my worth was determined by other people's recognition. That woman would have rushed to the hospital immediately, eager to prove her devotion and maybe finally earn the unconditional love she'd always sought. But I wasn't that woman anymore. "I'll visit," I decided. Not because he deserves it, but because I want to be the kind of person who shows up for sick relatives even when the relationship is complicated. But I'm not going to pretend that a heart attack erases what happened or that we have a relationship beyond polite proximity. Jessica smiled with understanding. "That seems healthy." Compassionate but boundaried. At Hartford Hospital that evening, I found Frank in a private room connected to monitors that beeped rhythmically, measuring heartbeats and oxygen levels and the various systems that kept bodies functioning. He looked older than I'd expected, diminished in ways that went beyond the hospital gown and medical equipment. Linda sat beside his bed, holding his hand with the kind of desperate tenderness that suggested she'd been forced to contemplate his mortality. "Rebecca," Linda said, standing quickly. "Thank you for coming. I know things have been difficult between us, but family is family, especially in moments like this. Family is family." The phrase that had justified so much interference and control and theft, now deployed to request the compassion they'd never extended when I'd needed support. "How is he?" I asked, directing the question to Frank rather than speaking about him as if he weren't present. Frank's voice was weaker than usual but still recognizably his. "The doctors say I'll recover, but I need to make lifestyle changes. Less stress, better diet, more exercise." We talked for a few minutes about medical details and prognosis and the various specialists who'd been consulted. The conversation had the stilted quality of people who'd run out of safe topics years ago and were trying to avoid stumbling into dangerous territory. Finally, Linda excused herself to get coffee, leaving Frank and me alone with the awkward intimacy of unresolved history. "Rebecca, I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Frank said after the door closed. "The trial, the judgment, everything that came after. I want you to know that I never intended to hurt you." The statement hung in the air, incomplete and insufficient. Never intended to hurt me, but had hurt me systematically for over a decade, never intended to steal from me, but had intercepted my mail and forged my signature and diverted my inheritance to unauthorized accounts. "Dad, intention matters less than action. You can't accidentally forge someone's signature on legal documents. You can't unintentionally intercept years of correspondence from a Swiss bank. Those weren't mistakes or misunderstandings. Those were choices. I thought I was protecting you from making poor financial decisions, from being overwhelmed by sudden wealth that you weren't prepared to manage. You thought wrong," I said quietly. "And even if your assessment had been correct, even if I had been unprepared for wealth management, you had no right to make those decisions for me. Adults get to make their own mistakes and learn from their own experiences." Frank closed his eyes, and for a moment I thought he might finally acknowledge the full scope of what he'd done. Instead, he said, "Your grandmother would be disappointed in how this family has fractured." The statement was so breathtakingly manipulative that I almost laughed. My grandmother, who'd specifically structured her trust to prevent exactly the kind of interference Frank had committed, who'd built safeguards against family manipulation, who'd tried repeatedly to establish direct contact with me before dying, would apparently be disappointed that I'd held her son accountable for systematically stealing my inheritance. Dad, Grandmother Helen would be disappointed that you intercepted communications from her dying wishes and prevented her from connecting with me during her final years. She would be disappointed that you forged my signature and stole money she'd set aside specifically for my independence. She would be disappointed that you taught Tyler to value family loyalty over basic honesty. I did what I thought was best for everyone. You did what was best for your need to control family resources and maintain authority over adult children who didn't need your management. There's a difference, Linda returned with coffee before Frank could respond, her expression suggesting she'd heard at least part of our conversation. We spent another uncomfortable half-hour making surface conversation about weather and hospital food and the various relatives who'd called to express concern about Frank's health. As I prepared to leave, Linda walked me to the elevator. "Rebecca, I hope you understand that we only wanted what was best for you. Everything we did came from a place of love." I pressed the elevator call button and turned to face her directly. "Mom, I've learned that love without respect is just sophisticated manipulation. You loved me in ways that required me to be smaller, less capable, more dependent than I actually was. That's not protection. That's control." The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside, leaving Linda standing in the hallway with the kind of wounded expression that suggested she genuinely couldn't understand why her daughter wouldn't accept theft as an expression of maternal devotion. On the drive home, I called Patricia to debrief the hospital visit and process the complicated emotions it had stirred up. "He still doesn't get it," I said. 5 years later, a heart attack that forces him to contemplate mortality, and he still thinks he was protecting me rather than stealing from me. "Some people can't afford to understand what they've done," Patricia replied. "The cognitive dissonance would be too painful. It's easier to maintain the narrative that they were acting from love than to acknowledge that they committed serious crimes against their own child." Does that ever change? Does he ever wake up and realize what he actually did? Sometimes. Usually not. People who are capable of that kind of systematic deception are often also capable of equally systematic self-deception. But Rebecca, his understanding or lack of understanding doesn't determine your peace. You've built an extraordinary life and created meaningful change for dozens of other people. His inability to acknowledge his actions is his burden to carry, not yours. Back home, I poured a glass of wine and sat in my living room surrounded by the physical evidence of 5 years of choices I'd made without interference or control. The furniture I'd selected, the art I'd purchased, the books I'd chosen, all of it reflecting my taste and values rather than anyone else's expectations. Emma's drawings covered one wall, a rotating gallery of kindergarten creativity that served as daily reminder of the relationships I'd chosen to prioritize. Tyler's children might carry complicated family history, but they also carried possibility and hope and the chance to grow up knowing that love could coexist with boundaries. The Foundation's latest impact report sat on my coffee table, showing metrics that would have seemed impossible when I'd first conceived the organization. Hundreds of beneficiaries assisted, tens of millions of dollars recovered, legislative changes in 3 states that made family financial fraud harder to perpetrate and easier to prosecute. My grandmother's key pendant hung around my neck, a constant physical reminder of the woman who'd understood that freedom sometimes required striking difficult blows. She'd given me the financial resources to fight back, but more importantly, she'd demonstrated through her trust structure that independence was worth protecting even when family dynamics made that protection complicated. I thought about the woman who'd sat in a Hartford hotel room 5 years earlier holding a temporary debit card and trying to comprehend the phrase $8.7 million. She'd been terrified and overwhelmed and uncertain whether she had the strength to challenge her family's narrative about protection and care. That woman had been braver than she knew, willing to risk everything familiar for the possibility of something authentic. She'd chosen truth over comfort, independence over approval, legal accountability over family harmony. Those choices had been difficult and lonely and occasionally terrifying, but they'd also been right. The Foundation's mission statement framed on my wall captured what I'd learned through years of recovery and transformation. Financial independence is a prerequisite for genuine relationships. Love that requires dependence is control wearing a compassionate mask. My phone buzzed with a message from Amanda. Just got confirmation that the Connecticut legislature will hold hearings on the Beneficiary Protection Act next month. Your testimony will be critical. I'd be telling my story again, exposing family dysfunction to public scrutiny in service of legislative change that might prevent others from experiencing what I'd experienced. It never got easier, but it remained necessary. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at the framed photo on my nightstand, my grandmother at 60, laughing at something outside the camera's view, looking confident and capable and utterly herself. She'd understood something that took me nearly 3 decades to learn, that the most generous gift you can give someone is the freedom to disappoint you, to make mistakes, to build their own life according to their own vision. She'd given me that gift through careful financial planning and specific legal protections. I was giving it forward through the Foundation, through legislative advocacy, through refusing to accept the narrative that family loyalty required tolerance of abuse. The grandfather clock in my hallway chimed midnight, marking the transition from one day to the next. Outside, December wind rattled bare branches with the promise of winter and the eventual certainty of spring. Seasons changed, hearts healed, systems evolved, and somewhere maybe another person was receiving the phone call that would transform their understanding of family finance and the difference between love and control. I fell asleep wearing my grandmother's pendant, grateful for inheritance that extended far beyond financial assets, knowing that the best revenge was living well and helping others do the same. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.